what do we mean by being wasteful? And we'll find out we need to be wasteful. There's something that explains what I mean. It's in a portion of the Word, Matthew 26, 6 through 13. This portion talks about somebody who was wasteful in the evaluation of some people who observed what this person was doing. So I'd like to get into this portion just a little bit to explain what we mean by being wasteful. And then I'd like to give you 5 examples, if there's time, of people from church history who were similarly wasteful, as to give us an idea of how we can also be wasteful. Okay, so the verses are Matthew 26, 6 through 13. You can follow along in your Bible, or I'll read them all to you. Okay, this is verse 6. Now, when Jesus was in Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came to him having an alabaster flask of ointment of great value, and she poured it on his head as he reclined at table. But when the disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, "Why this waste? For this could have been sold for much and given to the poor." But Jesus, knowing it, said to them, "Why do you trouble this woman? She's done a noble deed to me. For the poor you have with you always, but you do not always have me. For in pouring out this ointment on my body, she has done it for my burial. Truly I say to you, wherever this gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what this woman has done shall also be told as a memorial of her." Okay, I'd like to point out some things in this story to highlight what it means to be wasteful. First off, this person who poured something very valuable on the Lord was a woman. Luke mentions that she was a sinner. And if you read Luke's account in chapter 7, 36 through 39, you get the impression that she was known as a sinner. She had a reputation. So that might not be the first person you'd expect to impact the Lord. Okay, secondly, this woman, she had an alabaster flask of great value. And in Mark 14, where it also recounts this story, it mentions that this flask and the ointment in it could have been sold for over 300 denarii. And in those days, just 1 denarii was considered a good day's pay. So I was thinking about this a little bit. Even if you make minimum wage and you have 300 days of an 8-hour day, that's a significant amount of money. I think it was about $17,000. If you're working every day, that doesn't seem like that much. But if you have the lump sum of 300 days of work today, that's very valuable. I mean, that's, that would be handy to have. So this woman took something of a somewhat equivalent value, and in a moment, I'm not sure if it happened to her in an instant or this thought had been brewing in her. She took it and she broke it. She didn't, pour some and reserve some. She didn't even just pour it. What she did couldn't be undone. The box, the flask was broken. There was no turning back. She took something so valuable to her, precious to her, and poured it on the Lord because she thought that he was equivalent in value or more than that. And so he was worthy of it because of who he was and what he was going to do and what he wanted to do. It's so interesting that when the disciples saw this, they said, "Why this waste?" These people were handpicked by the Lord, the disciples. There was nobody on the earth like them who got to be with the Lord day and night. They saw everything about him. They knew his daily living. But they weren't the ones to do this. None of them poured out something precious. It was this lady. And their reaction wasn't like, well, it's time to set up a parade. They didn't put her on her shoulders, like they do after some sporting event where people accomplish something that people don't remember after a few years. They told her this was wasteful. The Lord's own disciples didn't consider the Lord valuable enough to do that. They thought it might be better to sell what she had and give it to the poor. That's a great idea, right? That's a very good thing to do. And maybe the Lord would lead somebody to do something like that. But the Lord's right here. So they considered doing something good more worthwhile than wasting something valuable on the Lord. Okay. Lastly, the Lord says something so striking about what this woman did. Where she, at the end, the last verse of this section in Matthew, it says, wherever this gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, there's, wherever the gospel goes, there's no exception. The Lord wants this story told. Okay, if you think about the gospel, it's the good news. It's related to the Lord. The good news is the Lord. What he is, what he's done, what he wants to do, his plan, his intention, his including us in that plan. This is all the good news. Does the gospel need any help? It's complete. There's enough in the gospel. Does it really need an addition? But the Lord felt it did. Wherever this gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what this woman has done shall be told as a memorial of her. I mean, this is shocking to me. The Lord wants this story told anytime the gospel is spoken as a memorial to her. But the gospel is about him. But the gospel about him should have a memorial about her. Why did this matter? This is God in the flesh. Can you, a human made this kind of impact on the incarnate God that he wanted his gospel to include her story forever. Why? Why does this story matter so much to the Lord? The gospel, as I've mentioned already, is about a wonderful person. And, the more we get into the gospel, we realize it wasn't just something I needed at the beginning. I need the gospel all the time. And I'm still discovering what the good news really is and who the good news is. Okay, the good news, the gospel is really about what the Lord is doing for us. All the price he paid, there's so many things related to the gospel, but it's really it's focused on us in one sense. Sorry. But the Lord is not only wanting to do something for us, He is looking for a response. He's looking to see, will someone, anybody, react to to this gospel and take something precious and pour it out on me? He's looking in speaking the gospel to find out who considers him so valuable. You know, we come to these college conferences, we go to Bible studies, I hope, or, you go maybe to a home of some believers and you fellowship, you gather together with people on campus. All of these things they are repeated impacts with the person of the gospel. And the typical and normal response should be, as we hear the gospel, we become more impressed. We may not be able to put it into words, but who is this person? I've never heard. I've met thousands of people, or hundreds. Nobody is like this person. I can't describe it, but he's worth everything. And a response in our being should be, I can't quite describe him, I can't explain him, but he's worth everything, and I want to waste everything on him. This is the response of this woman, and this is what the Lord is looking for when the gospel goes out. And this is what the Lord is looking for from us. This is what He wants from believers. So, what happened? John's account in John 12 of this story, when this woman broke this valuable thing on the Lord, it says the house was filled with the fragrance of the ointment. You weren't there. Let's just pretend we're going into this house. And it had already taken place. She had already broken the flask. And you open the door of the house and you just smell something so sweet. What is that? What happened in here? I don't know, but the smell, it's so nice. There's a better word for it, I'm sure. But that is the effect of someone pouring something so valuable to him or her out on the Lord. It fills the house, the fragrance. Maybe that's like that verse in 2 Corinthians about the fragrance of Christ to God. I don't know. But whenever people see the Lord's value and they pour something out on Him, there is a fragrance, and people can tell somebody has poured out. This fragrance is so attractive. There's a lot of things at your age group vying for your attention. There are a lot of things that want you to give. There are things out there that are pulling on your attention. There's so many things you could give yourself to. And I'm not saying any of these are bad, but, family life, a career, a cause, a party, you just name it. So many things you can give yourself to, but none of those have much of a fragrance. There was a famous politician named William Gladstone. I think this is William Gladstone. And he gave his life to politics in England. And he became the prime minister of England at almost the height of the British Empire. And at that time, they would say about the British Empire, the sun never set on it, because in any time zone on the earth, there was the British Empire. And this man was in charge of the whole thing. And later on in life, he said something like, if I could live my life again, I would be a missionary. He realized he had such a fantastic political career. He sold to the poor. I'm not saying that's wrong. He did many good things and excellent things. But when he came to the end of his life, where was the fragrance? He wanted to do something fragrant instead. And this is what the Lord is looking for, not just in this story. He wants this story to be told with the gospel because he wants more people to waste themselves on the Lord, to offer something to him so valuable and personal. I couldn't tell you what those things are to you. Maybe the Lord will touch you as we're fellowshipping about some things you could offer to him. But now I would like to give you 5 examples from the history, from church history, of people who similarly poured out something so valuable on the Lord and left a real fragrance. So the first person is a man named Robert Morrison. He was born in 1782, so this is a while ago. Robert Morrison, I'm just going to give you some basic facts about what each person did, and also give you some quotes from these people to give you an idea of what made these people like they were. Why could they do the things they could do? Why could they make the impact that they did? It's because they were poured out. It's because they were willing to pour out what was most precious to them on someone they considered of greater value than their most precious thing. And in most cases, it was their lives they were pouring out. Okay, so Robert Morrison, he was saved as a teenager, and almost right away with his salvation, he wanted to serve the Lord. It was almost immediate in his early teens. And you know what? He felt he should be a missionary at a time when missionaries were almost unheard of. So he was really cutting a path. And he told his father, and his father felt like he would rather his son stay and support the family. So he didn't have his father's support. But eventually, Morrison went to an evangelical college. He got training. He picked up a burden to go to China. If you know anything about the 1700s and early 1800s, this idea was crazy. It was wasteful. This young man was very smart. Why go to a country that won't even let Europeans in? You know, in that era, China, it had this long-standing policy that it was the kingdom as a bridge between heaven and earth. And therefore, everybody should come and in the area should come and pay tribute to China. And they would only let outsiders come to special ports. They wouldn't let them come into their country because they were inferior and unworthy of being in the Middle Kingdom. Why would you go to a place like this? And yet somehow the Lord impressed this man that he should go to China, and so that he could reach the Chinese and tell them about the gospel. So he managed to get to an open port where foreigners were allowed. And he went when he was 25 years old, and he became fluent in Chinese, which for a European at that time was almost unheard of. It took him 7 years before he saved and baptized anybody. Can you imagine being in a place that doesn't want you there, and working for 7 years with no result? Why this waste? You know, he was in China for 52 years, I think. No, I'm sorry. Not that long. But he spent his whole life in China after he arrived. and only returned to England once. And in that whole time, I think he only saved and baptized about 10 people. So, for 27 years of work to only produce 10 people, why this waste? Well, we're not the ones to make the evaluation. The Lord himself is. The other thing that Mr. Morrison did that would make an impact for generations to come was he spent all of his time working on translating the Bible into Chinese so that after he was gone, something could still reach them. He was frequently isolated in his service. And at one point, a fellow translator was sent to help him, but eventually that translator passed away and he was alone again. At one point, Morrison got married and had a child, and both of them passed away. He did have other children. He married again, but this man experienced so much hardship and so much loss. Near the end of his life, he wrote, he was running out of strength. He passed away at 52. He said, "The little strength I have, I will, with God's help, devote entirely to Chinese. Do not be anxious about me. I am in the hands of God, my Savior, who has been with me in many troubles and will never leave me." And then he wrote to his son shortly before he passed away, "Robert, my dear son, you must know that Dada is a king's servant. King William, the King of England, is my master. However, Robert, my dear boy, I have a greater master than England's king. The Lord Jesus Christ is he whom I serve." This is somebody who was poured out. He considered the Lord of greater value than his own life. His second wife suffered a breakdown and had to return home to get better. So he was alone with only one of his children when he passed away in his son's arms. You would think, why this waste? But what a fragrance. There's a stone put up by his grave by Chinese Christians 100 years after Morrison's death that says that Morrison died in the hope that 100 years later, the gospel he planted would grow 10,000-fold. And if you know statistics between the time Morrison arrived and 100 years later, I believe it was more than 10,000. Okay, the second person is Hudson Taylor. He was born 2 years before Morrison passed away. Okay, Hudson Taylor is very interesting. His father, before Taylor was born, consecrated his son that wasn't even born yet to the Lord. And what's more, his father told the Lord that he would give his son, if he could have one, to God's work in China. That's amazing. So poor Hudson Taylor, he didn't have a choice. Everybody has a choice. But when Taylor was 16, he got saved. Okay, after he got saved, he says this. So interesting. "Well do I remember that occasion," he wrote long after, "how in the gladness of my heart I poured out my soul before God, and again, confessing my grateful love to him who had done everything for me, who had saved me when I had given up all hope and even desire for salvation. I besought him to give me some work for him as an outlet for love and gratitude. Some self-denying service, no matter what it might be, however trying or however trivial. Something with which he would be pleased and that I might do for him who had done so much for me." you know, Mr. Taylor really saw something of the Lord's value. And he was willing to do anything the Lord required of him. It was like he was begging the Lord, give me a chance to pour out on you. You know, Mr. Taylor, as soon as he felt this call to serve the Lord, he restructured his whole life. He started being frugal. He started eating carefully. He began to exercise. You know, I know you guys. You go to the gym because, well, anyway, I won't go into the reasons. But this man exercised for his master. Okay, he began to tithe and practice living by faith. In other words, he knew when he got to China, things were going to be difficult. Very few Europeans were going into China at that time, and he couldn't depend on anybody for support except his master. He became fluent in Chinese by the time he reached China, and he also became fluent in 4 different dialects of Chinese. He learned not to depend on a foreign missionary society, and he also did something extremely unusual for a European. He became Chinese. He dressed like, if you look at pictures from that era, it is very different from the way they dress now. But he wanted to reach the Chinese for the Lord, so he changed his dress. He grew out his hair so he could put it in a ponytail like the men did at that time. He married. He founded a group called the China Inland Mission. And he would write books and speak, encouraging others to come and help him. And in fact, many people eventually would join him in China, especially one particular group we'll talk about soon, the Cambridge 7. And he also had a habit of reading the Word every day for 40 years, his whole life. His first wife passed away, and he also lost 5 of his children. I mean, the amount of suffering these people went through to pour out is hard to grasp sometimes. Okay, this is what he said. China is not to be won for Christ by quiet, ease-loving men and women. Okay, this is another thing he said. And this gives you an idea of someone who was willing to pour out what was most precious to him on the Lord. He says, if I had 1,000 pounds, China should have it. If I had 1,000 lives, China should have them. No, not China, but Christ. Can we do too much for him? Can we do enough for such a precious Savior? Can we do too much? He spent 54 years in China. And he was adamant that he would be buried in China. Over his life, over 800 missionaries came to the society he founded, and he was part of bringing about 20,000 Chinese to Christ. So that would be what? That would be more than 10,000-fold. Okay, the next person is a man named D.L. Moody, Dwight Lyman Moody. This man was born just a few years after Hudson Taylor. He was saved at the age of 18, and immediately he also felt the call to serve the Lord. And the way he served the Lord early on was at America's darkest hour in the middle of, the Civil War, which is still the costliest war in American history. Every war after that war still doesn't add up to the American casualties in that war. Okay, so he would preach the gospel to Union soldiers and Confederate prisoners of war. After that war, he founded a Sunday school that eventually became a large congregation, and he got married. while he was working in Chicago, this was all taking place in Chicago. While he was working in Chicago, twice his home burned to the ground in fires. He eventually met like-minded people, like a man named Ira Sankey, and they began to put together these big conferences to preach the gospel. And he would travel all over the U.S. and also to the British Isles. And at one point, he met an English evangelist who said to him, "Moody, the world has yet to see what God will do with a man fully consecrated to him." And you know what Moody's reaction was? It was something like, there's a lot of accounts of this story, but his reaction in his heart was something like, "By God's help, I aim to be that man." So somebody told him, "Oh, the world hasn't seen somebody who's totally poured out on the Lord." And his reaction wasn't like, "Not me. That's a high price." His aspiration in his heart was, "Well, I want to be that person. I want to be the first one." The Lord was worth it to him. Okay, so, some other things that Moody did as a man like this, really consecrated to the Lord, was he founded college student conferences. Sound familiar? Where he would encourage young students to give themselves to the Lord. This is a feature of people who have poured themselves out on the Lord. They know how good it is, and they want others to do the same thing. So he would gather college students at these conferences, and he would preach and he would encourage them to serve the Lord all over the world. And he would also give evangelistic conferences. The President of the United States and his cabinet attended one of these. And he would sometimes draw crowds of between 15 and 20,000 people. And he passed away at the age of 62. And I'd like to read you a quote to give you an idea of what it's like to interact with somebody who has poured himself out on the Lord. There's a fragrance with these kind of people. Okay, the man who ran into Moody at a barber shop was a man named Woodrow Wilson. I don't know if you've ever heard of this person. President of the United States at one point. It takes a lot to be in that office. I mean, the person in that office commands the respect of the world. And Wilson was in a barbershop. This is before he became president, but this is a man of presidential stature who was impressed by Moody. Okay, this is Wilson. While sitting in a chair, I became aware that a person had entered the room. A man had come quietly in upon the same errand as myself and sat in the chair next to me. Every word he uttered showed a personal and vital interest in the man who was serving him. Wilson recalled that before leaving, I was aware that I had attended an evangelistic service because Mr. Moody was in the next chair. I purposely lingered in the room after he left and noted the singular effect his visit had upon the barbers in that shop. They talked in undertones. They did not know his name, but they knew that something had elevated their thought. And I felt that I had left that place as I should have left a place of worship. When people waste themselves on the Lord, there's a fragrance. Mr. Moody was just going to the barber. He didn't even tell him his name, but he left a fragrance in the room. This is what happens when people pour themselves out on the Lord. Okay. The next person is a man named Dixon Host. He was born about a little under 30 years after D.L. Moody. Dixon Host was from England. He was born into a military family, and he had his father was in the military, and he had arranged for his son to be a military man too. So early on, Dixon Host obtained a commission in the Royal Artillery. But at the age of 21, Dixon Host got saved after hearing D.L. Moody preach in the UK. And his first thing to do was go back to his commanding officer and tell him, "Sir, I'm a Christian." It is very interesting. That's the first thing he did. Okay. So through Host's brother, he became friends with a lot of students at Cambridge, especially a group of 6 other young men who became known with Host as the Cambridge 7. You know, in this group of young men, there were 2 very famous throughout all of England cricket players. It's a sport, if you're not familiar with that. They were very well known. All these young men had a lot of academic promise. They had a lot of bright futures. You know, Host had a career before him as a military officer. But all of these young men were touched that there was something more worth their time than career, than sports. Host was actually the first of this group to write in and request to serve the Lord in China. And another thing about this group of people is I understand when talking about pouring out what's most precious to us, how daunting that can sound. That's okay. But what a lot of people in the history of the church have done is they have surrounded themselves with people who want to do that, making it easier to do it themselves. So perhaps it seems like giving the Lord what's most precious to you is difficult. That's okay. Find some who want to do that. Surround yourself with those people. Get connected with those people. And actually, you know, one individual pouring his or herself out on the Lord, there is a huge impact. But when groups of people do it, the impact is multiplied much more. So, with the Cambridge 7, this group of young men all dedicated themselves to serve the Lord in China. It sent shockwaves through England, and they were asked to travel around and share why they were going to waste themselves on the Lord. By the time they got on the boat to sail to China, they didn't even get to China before people started getting saved on the boat. The ship captain got saved, sailors on the boat got saved. Wherever they would dock, Host would get off the boat with one of the other 7 who was an ex-army officer, and they would go preach the gospel to the barracks of the English soldiers wherever they stopped. When they landed in China, immediately they were taken to a gathering of English expatriates, resulting in a number of them getting saved. Wherever a group of poured out people went, there was such a fragrance and such an impact. Actually, with these 7, 3 of them served the Lord in China until they passed away. And one other one went to Africa, where he passed away, so that's 4. 2 of them returned to England, and Host was the last to leave China. He stayed in China so long that he was interred by the Japanese during World War II. He was put into a camp in his, I forget, let's see, he was aged. I think he was in his 80s when he was interred. He lost his wife while they were in the camp, and eventually he was released, and he came home to the UK, where he died shortly after his return. One of his last word, he had kind of wasn't clear about anything near the end, but one of the last things he told visitors to his room was something like, "Oh, the beatific vision of Christ." Okay, another man, another group who poured themselves out on the Lord. The last one is a man named Horace Pitkin, an American. Moody was an American as well. Okay, Pitkin was he was born into a fairly wealthy family, as was his future wife. They were both well-to-do. They went to good schools. He was popular in school. He was good at athletics. He was musical. He was very accomplished. He was very liked. His plan in life was to be an electrical engineer. That degree, I hear so many people who want to be electrical engineers. Anyway, that was his plan. But he got saved at the age of 16 by attending one of Moody's gatherings. And he also attended Moody's conference, where he was inspired to give himself to serve the Lord in China. He developed a habit of praying and reading the Word for an hour a day. And he would gather with his friends at his university to pray for their classmates and study the Bible together and speak to their fellow college students about also giving themselves to serve the Lord. So when he was 20, he married a girl who was also interested in being a missionary. And so their honeymoon was to sail to China together. That was their honeymoon. You could say, what a waste, or that's crazy. But this is what it looks like to break what's most precious. Is there, for people, what is more precious than marriage? And they were even willing to pour that out on the Lord. So they took their honeymoon to travel to China. They only got a chance to serve there for about 4 years. Near the end of that period, they had a son while they were there. But while they were there, near the end of that period, things became so difficult for Pitkin's wife that she had to return to the U.S. to take a break. And she took their son. And while she was gone, a major rebellion broke out in China called the Boxer Rebellion. And during that rebellion, Pitkin was martyred. So, knowing that he had almost no time left, he wrote letters to his wife and friends and buried the letters in the compound so that they could have some last word from him. But those letters were dug up and destroyed. But he managed to get word through one of his friends he'd preached the gospel to from China, who wanted to stay with Pitkin until the end. But Pitkin told him this: do not risk your life any longer, but get over the wall into some place and go into hiding before the dawn. My letter may be found and destroyed. If you learn that it is, send word to my wife that God was with me and his peace was my consolation. Tell her that when Horace, that's their son, tell her that when Horace is 25 years old, I hope he will come to China to preach the gospel in my place. So, at the end of Pitkin's life, all he was thinking about was, how can I get my son to pour out on the Lord? There's such a fragrance here. You know, this is what the woman did in that story, pouring out something so precious on the Lord. This is what these people from church history did. But it shouldn't just remain a story in the Bible. And it shouldn't just be stories from the past. What about us? Even as I was getting into this, I just had this feeling, maybe from the Lord, like, Martin, do you still want to do this? This is what the Lord deserves. This is how valuable he is. So I could give you maybe some examples of how you too could pour out, or some idea of some things that you could pour out on the Lord. But instead, I hope you can find some time while the college conference is going on, maybe apart from everybody else, Just some time to spend between you and the Lord to find out how valuable He is and what He's worth and how you could respond to His value. I hope the Lord can really touch us, that He is worth pouring out everything.